I did want to talk about the family's role in early childhood because that is so central to everything that we do. And I think that to talk about why it's important, it's helpful to look at what happens when a family's not involved. And so, and I think this can be said for whether it's a child that's birth to 5 or 25, we could say the same things. And so one thing that happens is that we don't get a full picture of the child's abilities if we don't have the family involved. And so if that's the case, particularly perhaps if it's a person who has, can't speak for themselves and can't tell us what they know. So what might be a negative result of not getting good information from the family under those circumstances?
When you have an inaccurate IEP, you're trying to build that for certain things.
Right.
Miss out on a lot of things.
That's exactly. And so what if the skills selected for instruction are not meaningful for the family? Then it decreases the likelihood that that the family's going to do it at home. And if the family doesn't address it at home, then what's the negative result of that? If they don't think it's important and they don't address it at home, what's the negative? Right, exactly. It's unlikely if the child's just doing it in one environment and the parent's not addressing it at home, then they probably are not going to learn it. I have known some children that can differentiate and they can learn to, potty training's big in early childhood. They can learn to potty train in one setting and then not do it at home, but it certainly goes better if everybody's on the same page. It decreases family empowerment in the process. What would be what would you suspect would be a problem with decreasing family empowerment when children are really young? What's the negative outcome of that? What is the negative outcome of decreasing families' empowerment in the education process when children are very young? Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. They can get too dependent on the caregivers. This happens often in early intervention because often the interventionists are coming into the parent's home, and so those lines get blurred in terms of what is this person's role here, because these parents are often going through a major crisis at that time, and so they come to rely on these people with these letters at the end of their name to do everything for them. And then they go to preschool and they go into the big world of school and they don't know how to do it for themselves. And, one of our primary roles has to be to help prepare families for that next environment when they have to go to those IEP meetings with 20 people sitting around the table, because that's very intimidating for many of them. And the other negative impact is that others will not know the child as well as the family. And what happens, what's the long-term negative impact of people not getting to know a young child with a disability? Yeah.
Decreased socialization.
Absolutely. You have those decreased natural supports. I mean, what we don't want for these people is that everybody that's involved with their life be somebody that's a therapist. We want them to have natural relationships with people. And so it's really important that we begin that process really early on. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of families and issues around transition, because I know in adult services you all begin talking about that around the time a person is going to be graduating from high school. And so I want to talk about all of the transitions that parents of children with disabilities go through. Ann and Rund Turnbull, who are actually parents of an individual with a disability, have done a lot of the work around family life cycles or periods of change. And they talk about one of them as being when children enter early intervention. Many of the children that come into early intervention are children that have already spent a lot of time in a medical setting, in a neonatal intensive care unit. And so their first exposure to professionals is in that kind of medical environment where you have, somebody that's in charge of the child's, brain, and somebody that's in charge of the child's lung, and somebody that's in charge of the child's gastrointestinal system. And so their perception about what a service delivery is molded by whatever they saw when they were in the hospital with their child. And yet, as we move toward more educational kind of systems, then those paradigms begin to shift, and we have to think differently about how those services will be delivered. Then it changes from, I've got this nice little intervention that comes in and holds my hand when I cry. They come into my home and they love my baby like I do. And then I go to preschool, where the teacher has 20 children in the morning and 20 children in the afternoon. And so that's an enormous period of change for the family. And then things are going along really well, and then somewhere, either when they go into kindergarten or maybe when they're 8 years old, somebody goes from telling them they have developmental delays, which might be palatable to some parent, they're just a little behind, to your child has autism. And that's a really difficult time when that actual diagnosis comes on for the first time, because sometimes, or your child has, mental disabilities. That sounds so much different than your child has a developmental delay. And so that transition is really big. And then you also see transitions, into primary school, into intermediate, into secondary. And so I want you to see that whole continuum, to know that by the time you start working with an individual and his family, they've gone through a lot of transition before they just are now getting out of school. And there's a lot that family has gone through. There are a lot of different systems that family has gone through. And so what impacts these changes for the family are, first of all, this sort of paradigm shift. So we go from, in early intervention and preschool, a very family-centered kind of approach where we're really looking at the whole family, to school, where all we care about is the child, which gets more and more and more the older that they get in school. I was just so taken aback when my son went into kindergarten, because I couldn't believe that they didn't want to talk to me about anything, because I talked to his preschool teacher all the time. Now he started middle school this year. Well, forget it. You're never going to hear from anybody in school. Anybody at school. So you've got these real differences in, the way that families are interacted with in these different systems. The other thing is, as kids get older, we go from mandated services to services in adult world where they're non-mandated. And so that's a real eye-opener for parents. We start transitioning, at least at 14, and parents sometimes don't understand that you don't just get free stuff, 5 days a week. There's not automatically someplace a person goes, when they get out of school. And so that's a big change for them. The other thing that impacts them is how we perceive the child. Do we perceive the child as a set of labels, as somebody that has a brain bleed by the time they leave the NICU, to a 23-weeker, to a child with developmentally delay, to a child who's deaf-blind. The child is not a set of labels, but are we viewing this child as a child? And I'm going to share some just real quick stories with you about the differences in how that impacts the parent's view of their child when they're viewed one way versus the other. And the other thing that happens with families is that oftentimes, from a very young age, sometimes an astonishingly early age, professionals begin to limit children's life options. I never will forget the first program I worked in. I had a parent call me. Her child had a rare heart condition, and she called me and she was telling me about it and everything, and she said, he had not left the hospital yet. And she said, his doctor says that he'll probably be able to work at a gas station one day. That's astonishing to me that somebody would say to a parent of a newborn, but that's the kind of things that these parents hear very early on. So if you wonder why, when you get this young adult and you're trying to create employment opportunities for them and, you know, and help them out, if you wonder why the parent's not going along with this full force, think about that parent who was told your child may work at a gas station, you know, while he was still in the hospital, because that kind of stuff gets said to them all the time. So that's what really, you know, impacts this. So what we know about transitions, at whatever stage it is that it is a process and we have to begin early. And based on what those early transition periods were like, that's going to impact what happens down the road. And that parents really need some support all along the way to get through that process. And so for them to have some kind of buddy or somebody that's there to support them at meetings and to be with them is really important. And the last thing is that parents need to learn to bring the child to the process. And again, this doesn't matter if the child is, you know, 23 months or 23 years old. And that means that at every place along the continuum, that parents need to learn to say, this is about my child. This is not about, you know, services that we're going to fit this child into. This is about who he is, and let's create something that's for him. And so there are a set of practices in the world of disabilities that really match with that view of transition. And those practices are called person-centered planning practices. And I'm sure if you haven't learned about them yet, you will. But they basically mean all of these things that I've just mentioned. They mean that that we're not going to just view transition as something that happens between high school and adult life, but we're going to think about it all along the way. They mean that we're going to allow the family to bring to the process people that they know that are going to help support them through that process. And it means that we're going to bring the child to the process. We're not going to bring a set of labels and say, okay, you have this label, this label, this label, then I think being a gas station attendant would be a good job for you. But we're going to learn to get to know these children, okay? And so a lot of the work that I've been doing in early childhood with children with disabilities has been around using that set of principles to plan for transitions, not when children are older, but when they're very young, okay? And I use those principles really as part of the assessment process. Because remember, I said a huge part of that assessment process is having families who are telling us and getting to know the child. And so the way that we've done this is that we've developed a set of materials that are called Reach for the Stars, Planning for the Future. And it was designed, it is a person-centered, has anybody heard that term at all before? Person-centered planning? Have you heard of personal futures planning? Okay, that's a form of person-centered planning. Person-centered planning is the philosophy that underlies everything you do in personal futures planning. Personal futures planning was designed for individuals that are moving from institutions out into the community. It was designed for people that are moving from high school into adult life. And for many years, we had a grant here that I worked on where I was supporting families of teenagers to move into adult life, and I was finding that the parents were saying, what do you mean you want to get him a job? He can't do anything. What's your vision of his future? Oh, well, I just hope he doesn't sit in front of the television all day long. And it occurred to me one day that, first of all, part of the reason that was happening was because there were parents like my friend in 1988 who said, you know, your child will be a gas station attendant. So their expectations for what their son or daughter could do were killed early on. I've often said when I've talked about this that I don't believe that the hopes and dreams of parents of children with disabilities die when the child is born. I believe that other people kill them. I believe that it's doctors, I believe that it's teachers, I believe that it's the professionals who just all the time are telling you, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't because da-da-da-da-da, okay? And so we developed this process because we wanted to help families start thinking about their child's future early on. And secondary to that, to help use that information to shape the immediate future for the child, which is the child's educational program. So to use it as an assessment tool, if you will. One of the things that we found when we first started doing this, or using this approach with families, is that oftentimes in regular types of assessments, families don't get the opportunity to talk about their children in that way. You know, the way that professionals typically talk to families is to ask them about, especially with young children, what was your pregnancy like? How long were you in labor? Did you do drugs or alcohol during your pregnancy? So it's that kind of, a friend of mine calls it police report stuff, which instills a tremendous amount of guilt, particularly in the mother of the child. And so this approach is getting away from, it's really about getting to know the child. And I have a quote in here that this is what a parent actually said to me one time. This is the first time that anybody has ever allowed me to say something positive about my child. That's a really important perspective for you to understand. I don't know how much you all will work with families of individuals with disabilities when, you know, they're adults, but it's important for you to understand that perspective. This was a parent of an 18-month-old baby. That is tragic to me. That their experiences so far with the system were such that all they did was just talk about all the negative stuff. So I just thought I'd share a few stories. Dr. Bishop asked me to give some perspectives about parents, and that's what I've been trying to do. And I'll just share some stories of kids that I've worked with throughout the years, and kind of what we did, you know, imparting this new approach to planning for them. In the old way of thinking, this was a little girl we worked with, and she was getting ready to go to elementary school, and the mom wanted her to participate in some activities like other children. And one of the teachers said, in a meeting I was in, her mother just doesn't get it. Her daughter has severe disabilities. But you know what? We gathered a group of people around. We brought the child to the meeting, and what happened was she did attend regular kindergarten. And not long into her elementary school year, she was recognized by her local Girl Scout troop for getting the most badges for her age. She enjoys this horseback riding and swimming like other children do. This was an 18-year-old. When I met him, he was attending middle school, even though he was 18, and he was a big guy, so he looked a little bit out of place. And even though the high school was next door, and he spent most of his day still doing things like ring stacks and putting puzzle pieces together. And so we eventually, he got to go to a high school, local high school. His favorite class in high school was home economics. He graduated from high school and he attended the prom. I have some great pictures of him at the prom. He got actually one of the very first supported living waivers in Kentucky. I helped write his first supported living plan. And he volunteers 3 days a week at a local hospital. This was a boy that I met. He lived in Somerset in the institution down there. He spent most of his time attended a segregated school. He was one of the most self-mutilating individuals I ever met. And when I first met him, I had bruises up and down my arms. We were doing an assessment for HCI, actually, and where he hurt himself and he hurt other people. But he got the right people involved in his life. He's now living in a group home. He has a volunteer job. He's beginning to communicate his basic needs, and someone told me that he's recently learned to ride a stationary bike, which is very cool, because he did nothing. Flipped paper. Martha, her school insisted that she be placed into a special education class because she would get nothing out of regular education. But throughout her school career, she participated in all aspects of school life. When she was in 4th grade, she won a ribbon for the science fair. She made lots of friends, and she goes to popular concerts with her friends. And Sydney was a little girl that we had at the lab school a few years ago. She was deemed by many to be too sick to be around other children. And even her parents, even some of the parents at the preschool didn't really want her there. In fact, I gave a parent choice. I said, well, you know, I'm sorry, but this is what we do here. And so maybe this isn't a good fit for you to have your child here if you think we need to get rid of this child because she has a disability. The school system said she was 4 standard deviations below the norm. But after she came to our school, she had a whole new set of friends. She was learning to walk independently and communicate. She enjoys experience, and her health, not surprisingly, has dramatically improved. And so the point to all of this last little section is that the time to change and the time for transition is now. This is Sydney. And even though you all think about transitions of people into adult life, it starts when kids are really, really young. One of the students I worked with when he was adult graduated from high school. He was a rubella era. He was deaf blindness, and I got to go with him to high school, and watch him walk across the stage and say, "School is finished." And this is what was on the announcement. The future is now. We cannot change what is past, but we must use today to shape the future in the reflection of our dreams. So that's my closing thoughts for tonight. Thank you all very much.